Hello, and welcome to the Fancy Scientist podcast. Today, it's me. It's a solo episode, and I am talking about scientific conferences. We are headed into conference season. They typically happen over the summer. And in this episode, I am going to tell you pretty much everything that I have learned about scientific conferences over the years, what they are, what people do at them, and the top ones for anyone to go to in the wildlife space. And if you're not a career professional, scientific conferences are also things that you can follow on Twitter and other social media platforms to see what's going on in the science world. If you think you know about conferences or you've been to one yourself and are maybe thinking, I should just skip over this episode, I'm going to give you some pause because I have been to so many conferences. Since graduate school, even before graduate school, I went to my first conference in 2005. And I pretty much went to at least one conference a year until around 2020-ish. So I have been to tons of them. And really, it wasn't until somewhat recently that I figured out exactly why people go to conferences. Besides the obvious reasons, the deeper reason that happens at the higher levels and why it's important for you to know this now so that you can navigate conferences the right way early on in your wildlife career. So with that being said, let's get started and talk about what these meetings are all about. What are scientific conferences or meetings? Now, we're going to go over a couple of different types in this episode, but the most common or the most referenced one that when we're talking about scientific meetings as scientists that we're referring to are the large annual ones that are put on by societies. So these would be meetings like the Ecological Society, the Wildlife Society, and towards the end of this podcast, I am going to talk a little bit about those different conferences and what they're like as I have been to most of them. Basically, it's a gathering of scientists and aspiring scientists, and the purpose is to get together and share research. If you listen to my podcast episode number 16, What is Science Really? And the need to communicate, I talk about what science really is because a lot of people have this idea of what they think science is. They think it's just watching an animal in the field and describing its behavior, but there's more to it than that. And a big part of science that people often forget is the communication aspect. So scientists communicate in several different ways. The major way is through peer-reviewed publications where they conduct a study and they submit it to a journal and other scientists review it. I talk about this in the podcast episode. And then through a series of revisions and or rejections, the article, the study will eventually probably get accepted and published somewhere. And this is how scientists communicate their findings about research. If you come across websites that talk about scientific studies that have been published, let's say in National Geographic or The Guardian, they're referring to a paper that has been published. And it works by journalists following scientific research. And a lot of times journalists attend scientific meetings to find stories, as well as scientists having press releases about their papers to get the word out. And then these major publications pick up these stories and then you read about it in CNN or something. The main point of the scientific conference is to get people together sharing the latest science. So usually scientists are giving talks or poster presentations about their research. A lot of times it's research that has just been published, or it's research that's still in the works, or maybe that is going to be published. In addition to actual formal studies, You might have more conceptual talks too, idea type of talks. Before we get into those idea types of talks, let's go over what a scientific talk looks like and what these meeting structures usually follow. During these meetings, scientists give talks and sessions, and before you go to the meeting to present your research, you will submit an abstract, and then a committee decides if you're able to present or not. Then you have the opportunity to present your research, and it's usually done in 15-minute time slots. You have 12 minutes to present your research usually, and 3 minutes for questions to be asked. And usually they group them in similar subjects. For example, you might be in a session that's called animal migration patterns or restoration ecology. And these talks in those types of sessions are very science first types of talks. As I mentioned, they revolve around studies. For example, years ago, I presented my research on deer vigilance at, I believe, the Wildlife Society meeting. Either my paper was out or it was close to being out, and I presented these new findings. This is a great way for scientists to be able to learn about what is happening in their area, the new things that aren't out yet, or the things that are coming up, or the brand new things that have just happened. And then this also gives you the opportunity to talk to the author for either more information or collaboration. And we're going to get into this a little bit later, but collaboration and networking are huge parts of conferences. And there's definitely a way to do it right to maximize your opportunities. There are also other types of sessions which present ideas or concepts and are not necessarily science-based or based on vigorous scientific study. For example, you might go to sessions on community science or citizen science. That was really popular when I was a postdoc. I would go to large conferences such as the Society for Conservation Biology, and they would have sessions devoted just to those topics. And in sessions like that, you don't necessarily have to present on a specific study, but it could be a concept. For example, when I worked at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, we would do community science with teachers in classrooms. So I would present that research, and way before we even had the data analysis and the results of our real scientific study, we did not only conduct research from the kids' results for a paper itself, it was also embedded in other science peer-reviewed publications. But I presented on the concept of was this something that you could actually do? Could you get K through 12 students to collect viable scientific research? There might be a session on technology, like new technology. And I don't know, I guess a lot today would be on AI, but years ago, or even today, it's on drones. Drones are definitely more common on wildlife, but the technology I don't believe is quite there. So it might be a session on drones. And rather than, again, being a vigorous scientific study that you're presenting, you might present a concept of a new drone that you created or something like that. In order to give scientists more opportunities to present, and let me mention too, you can present as a graduate student, that's super common, and you can present as a full-blown scientist, or you can also present just based on your position. If you're in an education position, you might be giving an education talk, and each of the major scientific conferences in our field pretty much have these nuances. It's not just all pure scientific research. There's communications, there's education, there might be policy. And we can talk more about that as we get to the specific conferences. To give scientists and other people more opportunities to talk, there has been lightning talks. Those came about, maybe 15 years ago now. I think when I was a graduate student, they were becoming pretty new. Those talks are usually limited to, I think, 3 to 5 minutes. So super duper fast talk, just a couple of slides. And there's been a couple of variations of things like that. And then there's poster sessions as well. And in poster sessions, what you do is you create this giant poster, and it's modeled after the steps of science, just like you would for a peer-reviewed publication. In those publications, you would have an abstract, an introduction, methods, etc. You do the same thing for a poster. But a poster, it needs to be visually pleasing as well, because often the way that poster sessions work in scientific conferences is they will have them on display, and then they will have poster sessions where the presenter is expected to be at their poster, and other scientists walk around and they have the opportunity to ask you questions about your poster. And this is a really fun event. Usually there's cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. And because it's a poster session, there might even be hundreds, maybe even thousands of other posters there. You want yours to stand out. But even so, you want to make it digestible for people to understand. Therefore, you want to create a poster that is really visually pleasing as well. And if you are interested in this topic at all, or about presentation skills, I am happy to do some podcast episodes, maybe some free trainings on this stuff as well. I love talking about presentations and posters. It's so much fun. So that's really what happens at a scientific conference and what they are. As I mentioned before, they are put on by societies or organizations. So the themes of the sessions will be set by those organizations. And when you're submitting a talk, they will categorize what area that they think it fits best into. You might have some choices when you're submitting. And just so you know, your talk or poster might get rejected. It depends on the conference. Some are really competitive. Some, they only accept like half the talks. I think the Society for Conservation Biology is probably the most competitive. So if you get rejected, it's just part of the process. Check out my blog post, 11 tips on dealing with rejection. I will include that in the show notes, as well as the link to the other podcast I was mentioning. Okay, the next meeting is ESA, Ecological Society of America. This is one of the bigger meetings. This, along with SCP meetings, are going to be in the thousands. I think ESA was the biggest one I went to. And because it's ecology, you are going to have non-animal types of talks there. So stuff on plants, soil, fungi. And I like ESA a lot too. I've only been once, but ESA is a great meeting to attend because there's so much variety there. You're going to get a little bit of everything. The reason why I went to actually so many different meetings over my career is because my stuff did not fit into this neat box. Like, other people were studying mule deer and using telemetry to study them. So they would go to something like the Wildlife Society meeting. It was easy, it was straightforward. I was studying elephants. So elephants didn't really fit into the Wildlife Society meeting. And I was using genetics to understand their social structure. So I wasn't doing straight on conservation biology. So I had a hard time fitting in the conservation world too, but that was my favorite meeting. So I ended up going to a lot of different types of meetings. So ESA was one that I went to. And this, too, my elephant project wasn't straight up ecology either, because it was more social structure. I did go to the animal behavior meeting. It was more animal behavior. I'll talk about that in a minute, but I still didn't feel like I fit in there too. Anyway, ESA is a huge meeting. If you are somebody who gets overwhelmed, it might not be a good idea to go to this meeting because there are so many people there. But remember that there's a lot of people feeling overwhelmed and maybe a little lost. So just reach out to people. I do have a blog post about how to meet people at conferences. And I definitely talk about this in networking for introverts and in my Successful Wildlife Professional course. In that program, we go into details about how to do scientific conferences the right way. In that program, we go over in detail how to do scientific meetings the right way. The next meeting, as I mentioned, that I would go to, I've been to this one several times, is the Animal Behavior Society. And I didn't quite always fit into the Animal Behavior Society because they were very theory driven. So I wasn't conservation-y enough for Society for Conservation Biology, but I was too conservation-y for Animal Behavior Society. And this is why I recommend that people really get clear on understanding what research is. And this is what, again, I teach in the Successful Wildlife Professional, because a lot of people think it is like describing animals and using that information for conservation. And they say things like they want to do animal behavior. But when you go to the animal behavior, most people are studying insects, zebra finches. They're studying a lot of like model animals, and they're studying the theory of animal behavior. They're not studying it for conservation purposes by far the most part. You'll even get people who study like dogs and things like that at these meetings because, again, they're interested in the concepts of animal behavior theory. So I did like animal behavior, but these meetings were more like theoretical. So the research is not going to be as applied. For instance, I would go with people in my graduate school who were studying frog communication or vocalizations. Those are going to be the types of talks that people are presenting at these types of meetings. I remember there's this one scientist who did fantastic work on water striders, which are those little, they look like spiders, but they like are on top of more flat, still bodies of water. You can see them in creeks though. And they kind of like glide across on the top of water. They kind of like walk on water. And he did a lot of research on the behavior of them, about like what people call personalities, like how bold they are, and just like different factors that influence those things. So again, it's more theoretical. It's more about animal behavior and not as much about conservation. I've also been to the evolution meeting a couple of times because I was in a genetics lab at graduate school. People were very interested in evolution. So we would go as a lab several years. And at the evolution meeting, there's going to be a lot of taxonomic talks, not necessarily descriptive talks, because there's scientific research, of course, to describe speciation events, but a lot of that, like different species or groups of taxon that we thought had certain categorizations, but using genetics, and now people are using genomic research, they're recategorized different species. This was years ago, so we would be talking about genetics, and now it's all going to be genomics type of research. So I didn't love the evolution conferences, again, because I'm just so much more into applied research, and it is a bigger conference. Again, very, very theoretical. The Association of Zoos and Aquariums Conference, I think I only went to that one once. And like the title says, that one is going to be very focused on zoos and aquariums. This is beyond a scientific meeting. So there will be sessions on science, but there's also going to be sessions on customer service and guest behavior, like how people interact at the zoo, and not just with the animals, but, you know, maybe like different things do that have nothing to do with the animals. I used to work at Disney's Animal Kingdom. If you think of Disney's Animal Kingdom, in addition to being a zoo, that's a theme park. And there's a lot of zoos that have different things. They might have a 3D show, they might have a carousel, they might have different activities that are going on. So they'll have sessions that are directed around these things, or a lot of like talks for keepers about animal management, not necessarily research, but about best practices when it comes to handling animals, and a lot of talks as well on zoo, like for zoo directors or higher level people, on how to manage zoo staffs, zoo visions, things like that. Those are the biggest meetings in our field. And then there are going to be the taxa specific meetings. So for me, it would be what they call a mammal meeting, which is the American Society of Mammalogists. I should also say that these meetings will vary around the world as well. So Europe has its own mammal meeting, and you can definitely go to it, but the focus will be on European taxa. So it depends what your overall objective is and what you are currently studying. I've never been to a mammal meeting. I always wanted to go. And of course, the focus is on mammals. So there's all different types of research going on. Perhaps that was the meeting I should have gone to when I was studying elephants. There's, going to be talks on animal behavior, on evolution, on all different types of things that ecology, of course, that have to do with mammals. I heard really great things about the mammal meeting. It's not as big as some other meetings, but it's definitely big. There's hundreds of people that go to it, and I've heard it's really great. And then if you're doing different taxa, there's also the American Ornithological Society. There's meetings for people who study insects, who study herps. So just make sure you do Google searches for the topics that you are interested in, and then these meetings will show up. And don't forget, when you're looking at these bigger conferences, to also look for local conferences, because there might be state chapters having their own conferences, like I mentioned, but also there might be regional conferences as well, maybe like the Southeast region or things like that. It might not just be limited to a state. And then also be on the lookout for more specialized conferences too. These are ones that happen more infrequently, and they can be regular. Sometimes they're not as regular. So my example was the Urban Wildlife Conference. I really like this conference, and this was a small meeting. It was maybe dozens of people. And the small meetings are great because you can really get to know people. Because when you're going to the meetings where there's thousands of people, it's funny because you think with thousands of people, like you kind of get lost in the shuffle, but you do recognize people and you see people over and over and over again. But with the small meetings, it's just much more intimate and it's much easier to get to know people. You're kind of forced to. So I actually really going to those meetings, but my advice for that is, make sure it is something that is really specific to what you're interested in learning or you work on. When I was at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, I worked on urban wildlife, so it totally made sense for me to go, and I learned so much. But, if you're not interested in that area of study, you're not going to spend a couple of days going to a conference that you're going to meet people that are not really going to be that relevant to what you do. My final tip for going to meetings and conferences is to do not just go and hope that networking is going to happen. That's what I thought. I thought that networking was just really, here's my strategy for networking. This is what I was taught. Go to people's talks and then wait for them afterward to talk to them. I'm not going to say don't do that, but that's the last resort. Or I would just hope to just bump into people or just spark conversations, even at networking events. I was like, networking events is going to lead to something. It is going to lead to me getting a job. And that is totally possible, but unlikely. So what we do in the Successful Wildlife Professional Program and what we do in Networking for Introverts is a masterclass that I took from the networking section of the Successful Wildlife Professional Program. Is I teach you how to intentionally network before conferences, at the conference, and then outside of conferences too. So even if you're never going to a conference or you don't know when you're going, you can network literally every single day. That's what I teach you. And that's when things happen for you. There's a quote, I forgot who says it, but I'm totally going to botch it. It's something like, luck happens when preparation and opportunity meet up. That is it. I don't believe in just luck. I believe that you make things happen. And when you're prepared, when you have an understanding of how things work, and this is what I teach you, it literally has taken me over a decade to learn how to properly network at conferences. Networking is going to start to lead to you getting things like jobs. Like one of my students is getting her first publication because of networking. She reached out to a prominent scientist. So these things are going to happen to you when you network. And then finally, one more thing that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I'm going to mention now, is that conferences are really meant for higher level individuals. And knowing this as a younger scientist, you can use this to your advantage to collaborate and set up these larger collaborative projects. When you're a younger scientist and you go to these meetings, you think it's there to learn. And it is. It's important for you guys to learn. But when you go with your professors, you'll realize that very few of them go to talks. They don't go to that many talks. And really, what they do is use this time to network with each other, meet up with each other, discuss their research, what they're doing. This can happen over lunch, over dinner, over drinks, and then write papers together, come up with study ideas together so that they can get more publications, get more research done, and collaborate. So this is what I recommend you do at conferences. As I mentioned, I organized a symposium for one conference. This is something you could do. You could find a group of people that are interested in similar kind of research as you and get together and talk about how you can make a symposium happen for the conference the following year when it's going to happen again. And that is a great way to network and to increase your publications. Another great thing you can do at conferences is also go to meetings within conferences of different subgroups. For example, because I did a lot of community citizen science, there were groups on citizen science, and I would attend those meetings. And then once you get part of those meetings, then you get to know those people. So if the conference is thousands of people, the meetings is only going to be maybe 1,000 or so people. So it's a great way to get to know people better. If you have questions on scientific conferences, or if you love this episode, please share it. You can tag me in your questions, you can comment, and I will answer your questions. Sharing this episode, and please rank and review my podcast. It helps me so much reach people. It helps us really change the collective about this scientific community, because like I said, it's taken me over a decade to learn how to do this stuff right. And I'm here telling you guys, wanting to make you guys super successful. And make sure you check out the Successful Wildlife Professional and Networking for Introverts to make sure you are up on your networking game. Have a great day and be kind to animals, of course, and be kind to each other.